none of you truly benefit in a tangible way by saving somebody else's life. This is not for you. It does not make you wealthier. It does not increase your bank account. And in fact, subjects you to persecution and ridicule in the community and in your own social circles, I dare say. This movement must continue to be about love. And this movement must not be discouraged by what we see going around us. What I've laid out is a pretty heavy dose of reality that may, in fact, have people walking out of here being discouraged. Do not be. I believe we're going to win this debate. I believe that Obamacare will fail, and even if it doesn't fail, even if it doesn't fail, even if they pass something similar to what I've described, I think that sometimes America just needs a good kick in the pants to recognize what's happening to them. And I believe this debate has woken up a sleeping giant. And we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity as a movement based in love and life to connect with people who may not even be thinking of this debate in the terms I've described. But it's an opportunity for a sympathetic ear, because Americans will listen to what I've just said and what you will say and understand at its roots that that's right and become more sensitive to the issue of abortion and life. This is an opportunity for renewal. It's an opportunity for a revival in this country. We always talk about changing hearts and minds. Hearts and minds are out there right now. They don't know why, in many cases, why they feel the way they do. Tell them why. Touch their hearts. Reach them. Each and every one of you. Not just the people at the abortion clinics praying, not the folks at the Crisis Pregnancy Center. You're going to be asked later to help this organization. And I hope you do. But you need to go out every day, as long as this issue is before us, and reach people. Talk to them, educate them, let them know. And do not be discouraged by failure. One of the things that I learned from the partial birth abortion debate is that you have to look at what happens, particularly in the legislative arena, but also with life. And you cannot look at it through your eyes, but you have to trust God that through His eyes, that failure will not in fact be failure. I say this all the time. I thank God in 1996 we did not pass the partial birth abortion bill over President Clinton's veto. I thank God that his veto was not overridden again in 1998 and that the Supreme Court struck down a state statute the year later. Why? Because if Bill Clinton would have been smart enough to have signed that bill when it first passed in 1996, I guarantee you, no one in this crowd would have ever heard of a partial birth abortion. It would have been a non-issue. It would have been one of those things that was considered sort of a no-brainer, nobody paid attention to it. But as a result of our failure to pass that bill, people learned about it. It was reported on the front page of every major newspaper. It was a huge battle. Partial birth abortion became the face of abortion. And guess what happens in a partial birth abortion? The baby is born, all but the head. You can see arms, legs, toes, fingers, and yes, head. It is a baby. And for the first time since Roe versus Wade, attitudes on abortion changed in America in the late 90s. Why? Because we failed. So do not let failure stand in your way. God will be faithful if you are faithful to Him. Mother Teresa always says God does not call on us to be successful. He calls on us to be faithful. Well, I'm going to close with a couple of stories that illustrate that point in my life. I probably needed more reinforcement from God to continue on what I was doing. Because it was hard. You get beat up a lot for doing what we're doing. Thank these pro-life legislators. Thank them. It is not easy for what they do. It's not politically correct. Do you ever wonder why Supreme Court justices come to the Supreme Court and may be marginally okay and then turn the other way? Go to a cocktail party in Washington and be the skunk at the garden party who's pro-life. Hang out. Hang out in Washington, D.C. or any major city in the East Coast or West Coast for that matter, and espouse traditional views of marriage and of life. It's not easy. It does not make friends. It makes you very unpopular. So I needed help and support, and God was there and gave it to me. It happened first in 1996. And this was a debate, again, my first time that I really had managed this debate. And we were debating all day long. And Senator Boxer, I was here at the Republican platform, and Senator Boxer was over on the Democratic side. And Senator Boxer was talking. I'll read from my wife's book. My wife wrote a book, and I'll tell you in a minute what it's about. Wrote a book called Letters to Gabriel, which is a book that is used in lots of crisis pregnancy centers around the country. It's a little book that she wrote in 1997, the year after this debate, because we had our fourth child, a son named Gabriel, who was born on 12 years ago yesterday. And I will never forget being on the floor of the United States Senate in 1996 and standing there. My wife at the time was 19 weeks pregnant. And Senator Feinstein was going on about these children well, I'll quote her. She says, "Some women carry fetuses with severe birth defects late into pregnancy without knowing." And she was giving this as a reason that we had to keep this provision, this abortion procedure, legal. Because once women find out that their child isn't what they were expecting, they should be able to abort them. She said, for example, fetal deformities are not that easy to spot early in pregnancy. Include cases where the brain forms outside the skull or do not form at all. Or fetuses with no eyes, ears, mouths, legs, or kidneys. This veiled call for euthanizing the disabled. And I listened to that, thinking about my own child that was in my wife's womb. And I got up and said, I don't know. My wife is 19 weeks pregnant. I have no idea whether this child is healthy or not. But why would that matter? Any more than my 2-year-old is healthy or not. If my child is sick, I will do everything I can to save that child. I don't see the difference. Well, a week later, we went in for a routine sonogram at 20 weeks. And the sonographer going over my wife's abdomen and looked over at us and said, "Your son has a fatal defect and is going to die." Great bedside manner. And we were stunned. I was particularly stunned as I thought about it over those next few days. Because here I was for the first time in my life, doing something that I never felt called to do. Standing up for what God wanted me to do. Speaking out on abortion for the first time in my life. Listening to what God's call was. And this was his answer. He's going to take my son. I was pretty angry. What do? We did what every parent would do, we hope. We tried to save his life. We actually had intrauterine surgery done to try to repair the defect. and it succeeded. But the surgery caused an infection in her womb, and she delivered Gabriel 2 days later. Less than a day later. He lived 2 hours. As I like to say, he lived 2 hours in our arms and knew only love his entire life. Throughout the next year, Karen wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Middle of the night, getting the pain out. And she turned it into a book called Letters to Gabriel, which, believe it or not, sold 25,000 copies from a publisher that only had ever published one book and hasn't published another one since. But it was a miracle. And I can show you the letters, the hundreds, maybe thousands of lives that were saved because of that little book and our little story. I always say, Gabriel, to my kids, I said, you have a lot to live up to in having an impact on the world that your brother Gabriel's had. God will be faithful. It's hard to see sometimes. It's painful sometimes. But if you're faithful, he will be. Well, the story goes in Karen's book that at the end of the debate, Senator Boxer was thanking the women who had had partial birth abortions for coming forward with their stories. What Senator Boxer did, Pete will probably tell you, did the same thing over in the House, is they brought women who had had partial birth abortions and lined them up outside the House and Senate chambers. And you had to walk by them as a member of the Senate and House, and they would confront you, and they would be crying, telling you, please don't do this to us. So Senator Boxer says, they are crying. They are crying because they do not understand how senators could take away an option. They're crying because they do not believe that those senators truly understand what this meant for their families. Remember, these are letters to my son, so Karen writes, Daddy said in response, the senator says she hears the cries of the women outside this chamber. We would be deafened by the cries of the children who are not here to cry because of this procedure. The Washington Post described what happened next. The Washington Post. Quote, Republican Senator Rick Santorum turned to face the opposition and in a high pleading voice cried out, where do we draw the line? Some people have likened this procedure to an appendectomy. That's not an appendix, he shouted, pointing at a drawing of a fetus. That's not a blob of tissue. It's a baby. It's a baby. The Post continues. And then, impossibly, in an already hushed gallery, in one of those moments when the floor of the Senate looks like a stage set, with its small wooden desks, somehow too small for the matters at hand, the cry of a baby pierced the room, echoing across the chamber. No one mentioned the cry, but for a few seconds, no one spoke at all. I've been in the House 4 years and in the Senate 12. In my entire time there, I've never heard a cry of a baby in any of those chambers. I've talked to members who have been there 40 years. They've never heard a baby cry. Why? Because babies aren't allowed in the Senate chamber. You have to be 6 years of age to be in the Senate gallery. So how did it happen? Well, the reporter actually ran around and tried to find out what happened. And what did he find? He found a young couple from London visiting America. And their baby was in the hallway outside the Senate gallery in the upper floor, crying. And at the very moment I said those words, someone opened the door to the chamber next to them and closed it. God will be faithful. God will bless what you're doing if you're faithful to him. Finally,